Have you ever seen a Dragon Ball movie that actually felt like a movie? Well, if you haven't, I suggest that you watch Dragon Ball Super Broly in theaters or when it comes to DVD and Blu-ray, because that, my friends, is definitely worth your time. And in today's video, we will be going over a good and bad breakdown, being honest about what was positive about the movie and negative about the movie, as we have finally gotten a chance to watch Dragon Ball Super Broly twice, and this time we will be giving an analytical breakdown of it today. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into this video. So starting off with the good, we always got to start off with the positive things of side of the story. And when we go into the situation with Frieza, I think that the movie started off in an extremely captivating and powerful way, watching Frieza and his entire force invading planet Vegeta. And the reason why I say this is that when we were first introduced to Frieza's henchmen in the Namek arc, we saw them incrementally introduced into the series. For example, we saw Kui, we saw Zarbon, we saw Dodoria, then we saw the Ginyu Force, and then we saw Frieza in all of his transformations, and then eventually we got a chance to meet King Cold. But in Dragon Ball Super Broly, because we saw all of them all invading at one time, really shows you that Frieza is bringing all of the chips to the table and trying to show King Vegeta and the entire planet who they're actually dealing with in the situation. And when we see that scene where Frieza's taking out the Saiyan-like snipers because he can detect them with the scouter, that was a very menacing way to create tension from very on against the villain that we all know that the Saiyans were going to eventually fall to at that time. And when we also talk about tension on the same subject, we also got to talk about Paragus and King Vegeta. So, in the first Broly movie, we obviously know that Paragus and King Vegeta weren't on the best terms, as King Vegeta actually attempted to stab and kill Broly, and later on that day, Frieza tried to blow up the planet and Broly saved their lives. In this situation, Dragon Ball Super Broly had a significantly better and realistic change to this whole story. Reason being is that instead of Broly actually dying, King Vegeta sends him away because he's jealous that Broly's power is actually stronger than his son's. And I think by doing this, it actually shows more character development on Paragus's part, as he goes throughout the entire universe and actually goes onto a Saiyan spaceship to try and bring back his son to make sure that he's okay. And I feel like showing that made Paragus seem to be a significantly better father, and it also shows the animosity between King Vegeta and Paragus in a much deeper way, especially looking at the time skip that was shown later throughout the movie. So I definitely feel like, although there wasn't an attempt on Broly's life, this was much better, especially since believing that a baby can hold you in a ball and travel throughout the universe just seems to be a much more unlikely way of survival, and this just seems way more realistic. And as we conclude with the positives of this movie's exposition, we have to talk about the final scene where we see Frieza blowing up planet Vegeta, and we could see like the amount of life forms that he was scanning with his scouters slowly going down until it eventually hit zero, where we would all know that all of the Saiyans eventually died in the explosion. And I definitely feel like that was a very artistic and creative way to show Frieza's menace towards the entire planet Vegeta all at once. But when we move on to the other elements of this movie here, guys, we gotta go to what would have been the present timeline, or shall I say after this flashback sequence that took up a lot of the movie, and we get to the sequence of Frieza and Bulma wanting the Dragon Balls, and Frieza obviously sending in his goons to steal the Dragon Balls from Bulma. And the thing that I feel really is unique about this sequence here, guys, is that both Frieza and Bulma want the Dragon Balls for two completely different reasons. Bulma wants it to look a little bit younger, and Frieza wants it to gain a few centimeters in height. And the reason why I found this was a very weird sequence, guys, but also a very powerful sequence, is because the childlike, selfish wish of those two characters is actually very realistic and in character. Remember, at the beginning of Dragon Ball, Bulma wanted to use the Dragon Balls to wish for a boyfriend, and Frieza wanted to have immortality, but because he kind of knows what it's like to be immortal, he really doesn't want that in this situation. And because these characters are in a significantly more peaceful time, this would be a time where they would use these wishes for selfish purposes, especially since Frieza's empire is already resurrected, albeit a lot smaller. And while we're on the subject of humor, we have to admit that watching Beerus become the babysitter of Bulla is definitely a highlight of this film, because it creates a subplot within the film that could actually make Beerus somewhat effective while also not being a part of the fight. As we've seen in all these Dragon Ball movies besides Battle of Gods, that Beerus is always kind of just on the side and just observing what goes on. And as we move on to the next sequence for analysis here, guys, we gotta go on to the interactions between Lemmo and Shilai. And what I love about these characters specifically is that the way they interacted with each other under Frieza's rule just feels so human-like and realistic. The reason why I'm saying this is that when you compare this to the rest of Frieza's forces, so if you look at, let's say, a Zarbon and a Dodoria or the Ginyu Force, whenever they're talking to each other and behind Frieza's back, they're so terrified of Frieza, they're so afraid of what he's going to do to them, and they try really not to say anything that might have crossed over Frieza's line of rule. Whereas with Shilai and Lemmo, it kind of just feels like, yeah, Frieza kind of sucks, but you know what, we're kind of just doing this job because we got to do what we got to do, and you know, Shilai obviously joined because she wanted to gain clout, and Lemmo's just doing it as it's a part of his job. And I feel like their conversation while they're on the spaceship going to look for what would eventually have been Broly and Paragus was just such a refreshing conversation, because we just never really get to see people who work under Frieza just talking in such a true and real manner. And I felt that watching that interaction before we met Broly was very good for the movie itself, because it added a lot of realism and personality to Frieza's forces other than just listening to every single thing that he said. And while we're on the subject of Broly, Shilai, and Paragus, I definitely think the movie did a very good job in creating the relationship between those characters. In the case of Shilai and Broly kind of have a Goku and Bulma-like dynamic, where Broly is kind of like this guy who's away from technology, you know, somewhat like a Tarzan-esque character, whereas Shilai is way more technologically advanced, can teach him, you know, basic social etiquette like saying thank you, and also how to unwrap a chocolate bar. And when we go back to the beginning of Dragon Ball, that dynamic between Goku and Bulma, where she's kind of like his big sister to the little brother, was a great and interesting dynamic that sparked the entire franchise. So seeing this with Broly was definitely a unique thing. And in the case of Paragus, I think when we see the sequence where Broly's at the bar and he starts, you know, grabbing that guy who is threatening Shilai, and Paragus essentially, you know, just uses his little remote to deactivate Broly's power, I feel like that scene can be interpreted in two ways that are realistic on both sides. On one hand, from the perspective of Shilai, it makes sense from her perspective that, you know, Paragus is harming his son and he's not really looking out for what, you know, Broly's doing. But from the same point of view, you can also look at this from Paragus's point of view and say, no, Paragus is actually doing the right thing, because if Broly, you know, really unleashed his power, he would have definitely have killed that guy. And Shilai at that time had no idea how dangerous and powerful Broly can be when he loses control. And obviously, since Paragus grew up on that planet all by himself with Broly, he obviously is aware of what Broly can do, and Shilai actually was ignorant when she was saying how he's harming his son, because Paragus actually knew what was best for him. But we can definitely see that while Paragus would have been looked at as a bad father in the original Broly movie, you can seriously say that he was just a strong and stern father, but also loving in this film. But you can't have a Dragon Ball breakdown without talking about what was good about the fight sequences, and boy oh boy do we got a lot to say here. So, in terms of the actual fighting, guys, one of the best things that I feel this fight did was it was so well paced. I never felt that there was one fight that was too long or too short, and the fight sequences never really seemed to drag out. For example, when we see the fight beginning between Vegeta and Broly, we see that Vegeta is clearly a way more dominant fighter than Broly because he has way more experience. He's learned all of these transformations that Broly didn't even know existed, and it was kind of like showing the dynamic between a master versus, you know, this brute who just has all of this insane innate potential. And then we continue to see the fight is slowly changing, and Paragus and Frieza are starting to give up hope in Broly. And what's great about Paragus losing faith in his own son's ability to fight against Broly is the fact that in looking at that sequence, guys, that actually shows you that Paragus himself doesn't even know the extent of his own son's power. So not only was Broly's power a shock to Broly himself, but it was also a shock to his father and Frieza and everyone else, which added a lot more mystery to his power instead of already knowing that he was ridiculously, insanely powerful from the very beginning. And if this movie came before the original legendary Super Saiyan film, this would have been a way more mysterious way to hype up Broly's power instead of already showing you that he was the legendary Super Saiyan from the beginning. And I think one thing that gets lost about the fight sequence of this movie compared to a lot of Dragon Ball films is that a lot of Dragon Ball films usually have a very unique fighting arena where most of the battle takes place. So in the first Broly movie, we have the fake planet Vegeta. You know, in BoJack Unbound, we keep seeing the fighters fight in different stages as they're just knocking each other through these large areas. And then in this movie, what I felt really made this fight 10 times better was the different areas where they actually fought. We see this icy-like tundra background where we're seeing Goku and Vegeta going all out against Broly, and then, you know, they slam under the earth where it's like this extremely fire-like background, so we're seeing like a really cold place next to a very hot place. And then after that, when, you know, we eventually see the transformation into Gogeta, I feel like that was also awesome, in addition to all of the humor that led up to this, where Goku and Vegeta were failing with their fusion forms, and we see Goku and Broly fighting in this huge dimensional void. And, you know, in this process of them fighting in this dimensional void, you know, right before that, Frieza was like getting wrecked as Goku and Vegeta had to learn how to actually do the fusion dance. And I feel like just watching Goku go from so many different locations throughout all of these places really hyped up the battle, because it never felt like the battle was in one place, and it was all mixed in such a way that I felt that it was brilliantly put together. But as always, guys, we gotta talk about some of the bad issues of the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie, and one of the first things we have to talk about is the Bardock Dragon Ball minus retelling. Now, don't get me wrong, I really loved seeing Gine being animated for the first time. It was great to see her character. And while a lot of Dragon Ball fans might like that they retold Bardock's story, you could argue that that was probably the weakest part of the movie. You see, the whole original reason why Goku went to planet Earth was because he was a low-class Saiyan warrior and was considered irrelevant, so they sent him to a weak planet because they felt like he could adapt to those weak organisms from the very beginning. In this case, the reason they sent Goku to planet Earth wasn't because he was a low-class Saiyan, it was because they wanted to protect him from Frieza. But it's like, well, if you really wanted to protect him from Frieza, then you should have probably went to another planet yourself if Frieza was going to be that much of a threat. And even if they're able to detect you with their scouters, you're still trying to save your life. So it didn't really make sense. It's like, okay, well, you save your son, but you could also save yourself, and if they detect you and hunt you down, well, getting off the planet is safer than, you know, trying to just stay there and wait for Frieza to make his move anyways. So the whole logic of sending Goku away just made a lot more sense. And even though Gine was saying that, you know, Bardock had a change in heart, you know, because most Saiyan fathers didn't really care about their sons, that was also contradicted in the movie too, because both Paragus and King Vegeta were very caring of her sons. So clearly, from the three most dominant Saiyan men that we saw from the very beginning of the movie, it didn't really seem like they didn't care about their sons, because all three of them did. And while we're on the subject of Paragus, we have to talk about the death of Paragus. Now, I do feel like that was a very powerful scene, watching Paragus die and watching Broly transform and bring out his true potential. But at the same time, guys, we also have to admit that that scene, it was so quickly paced that we really couldn't resonate with it. It's just like, you know, unlike other emotional scenes in Dragon Ball where characters die, we kind of have a minute or two to really resonate with it. And this kind of seemed more like a joke kill, where I really couldn't, you know, absorb the impact of Paragus's death to Broly. And obviously, if Broly reacted like that, you know, obviously Paragus meant a lot to him, and the pacing of that scene was way too quick for me to absorb it as a viewer. And in terms of the actual fight, the only true criticism I have is how Goku entered the fight against Broly. So we see that Vegeta powers up, he started to dominate Broly, but then as Broly figures out his power, he starts dominating Vegeta. But Goku just says, alright, now it's my turn to fight you, and from that point on, we don't see Vegeta for like 15 minutes until we see him trying to tag team Broly with Goku. And the reason why I have a problem with that scene is that it felt extremely out of character for Vegeta to, you know, just allow Goku to tag into a fight when he himself isn't fully prepped up into his full potential and power, as he was only fighting as a Super Saiyan God. And if you go throughout the entire history of Dragon Ball fights with Goku and Vegeta fighting against a foe, every single situation has always started with Goku going in first, Goku gets knocked out, or Vegeta gets knocked out, and that's the only reason why Goku was allowed to tag in. So with Vegeta powering up and trying to get a feel for how Broly fights and just, you know, allowing Goku to jump in, that really felt out of place, and I feel like they could have thought of a better way to bring Goku into the battle, and probably should have shown Vegeta struggling more to actually give a reason for Goku to jump in. And last but not least, for my final criticism, it would have to be the ending. So I think the ending is mixed. There are certain positive things about the ending, and there are certain things that make you scratch your head. What I think we should like about the ending is the fact that we definitely get a chance to see, you know, Shilai and Lemmo going over to where Broly is to actually protect them from Frieza. And I feel like that was a very strong way to end the movie, because it actually gives Shilai and Lemmo a reason to be with Broly, because Broly is one of the few people who can protect them from Frieza from obviously getting out of his military and kind of going off and doing their own things. However, I also gotta admit here, guys, that if this was a self-contained movie, this would have been probably the worst ending, because nothing happened besides Paragus dying. The movie would have just given you a flashback of everything that happened. Broly, the villain of the movie, would have been okay. Frieza, the villain of the movie, would have been okay. And Frieza's entire empire is intact. So if Dragon Ball Super couldn't scream that they were going to continue the series more than they did with this ending, everything is kind of already answered for us here, because they literally didn't kill off any of the characters, and they left this story the exact same way it was before the movie began, other than the fact that Broly tapped into more of his power and his father died. And Lemmo and Shilai are now with Broly. And that's essentially one of the biggest criticisms I would have had with the movie if it was a self-contained film where we obviously didn't expect it to have a huge continuation. So overall, guys, despite my criticisms, I'll have to say that this is by far the best Dragon Ball movie of all time. This was the first Dragon Ball movie that I saw where I actually felt like it felt like an actual movie? But at the same time, it had some issues that kept it away from being a perfect film. But regardless of all of that, it's not perfect, but it definitely would have gotten 5 out of 5 stars. It was a fantastic movie, and even though it was a lot more lighthearted than the original Broly film, it was entertaining enough for me to watch 2 times, and I definitely recommend all of you guys going out to see this in theaters, as I'm assuming most of you guys have seen it in theaters if you're watching me talk about all of this in the film. So overall, that is my good and bad breakdown for Dragon Ball Super Broly. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always said, have a great day, guys, and check out my video on why Broly isn't a villain.